when I get to 200 subscribers, wait, that's not what I sound like. When I get to 200 subscribers, I will watch this cringy lecture by the big man Paul KENGOR himself and make a response video. Tell your friends and get them to subscribe. Why do you do this to yourself, Ghost? Why do you make these commitments that you know you're not going to want to follow through with? Did you think that you would never get to 200 subscribers? You knew it would happen eventually. You just didn't expect one of your videos to blow up and attract a lot of new attention. You're not ready for the pressures of YouTube stardom. You wanted to be one of the BreadTube hotshots, didn't you? How does it feel being famous now? Not so hot, is it? Whatever. I promised you guys I would review it, so looks like that's what I gotta do. My ADHD brain is gonna blank out after about 5 minutes, so I'm gonna have to rewatch the whole thing several times, probably. You can do this. You can do this. You can do this. You can do this. You've gotten through worse.
I have the great opportunity of introducing our next speaker for today, Paul KENGOR. Dr. KENGOR is a professor of political science at Grove City College and is the executive director of the college's conservative think tank, the Center for Vision and Values. A New York Times best-selling author of more than a dozen books, Dr. KENGOR is also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a senior editor at the American Spectator.
So we're gonna watch a lecture from our old pal Paul KENGOR, snubbed literary genius and Catholic anti-communist crusader, whom you remember from our article review we did back in October. The thesis of Paul's argument is thus: no reasonable person who reads Marxist theory walks away agreeing with it, that Marx's own words are in and of themselves an argument against communism. Paul asserts that most leftists have not actually read Marx, and that Marxists are infiltrating our country and our left and liberal institutions, duping millions of young people into being pawns for their evil agenda. And I'm obviously a living refutation of that claim. Look, I've read Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and Engels. Fuck, I've even read Stalin. And yet here I am. Of course, you don't need to read a shit ton of theory to be a politically active socialist. Not everyone has the time or energy to do that. But you should read theory if you can. It's good for you. Helps you grow up to be big and strong. Obviously, I cannot show you the entirety of Paul's lecture in its full unedited glory. You can watch that through a link in the description, if that's how you want to spend precious minutes of your short and finite life. If you see the screen flash black for a millisecond, consider that an ellipses to indicate I've edited something out. Let's continue.
He also has 8 children, so I'm sure you've gathered by this point that he doesn't have much free time.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Okay, I'm just gonna say, Catholics with like 1 million kids, that's like a thing. I come from a Catholic family. My grandparents had 10 kids, my uncle has 9. A lot of the families in the Catholic school I attended had a shit ton of kids. This is partly because they refused to use birth control, but it's also kind of a petty bourgeois status symbol among those circles.
Many of my friends who attend other schools say their professors discourage diversity of thought and will penalize students' grades if they submit a differing opinion. This is not so for Dr. KENGOR. I remember several times throughout the semester hearing Dr. KENGOR say, "Come on, I'm sure someone has to disagree with me. If not, will someone at least play devil's advocate?"
I imagine you've heard this diversity of thought talking point before, where right-wingers are salty the left isn't humoring their ideas, and they appeal to some warped sense of liberal values. You value diversity of race and gender, but you can't value diversity of thought? First of all, we don't value diversity of race and gender. We accept diversity as a fact of life, and value the dignity of human beings of each race and gender. You cannot value human dignity while simultaneously humoring the right's misanthropic authoritarian bullshit. This talking point is a cruel mockery of the fight against bigotry, especially since the ideas the right is asking us to humor are usually bigoted ones. A political debate is a conversation between two people who have different ideas about how the world works, but a common material goal they're working toward. Hey, we're on the same team at the end of the day. Let's sit down and talk this out so we can come up with a solution that works for everyone. But we have no common interests with the right. We want emancipation for the working class. They want the working class to shut the fuck up and go back to work. We should engage with working class conservatives since we do have common interests with them. But propagandists for the ruling class like Paul deserve no seat at the table. They would just use that seat to bog us down and frustrate any attempt at progress.
So this topic that I have today is not very kind and not very nice. In fact, it's pretty ugly, it's pretty deadly. And it's called, I've got a PowerPoint slide as well because I want you guys to see these quotes. But you could also call this What I'm Not Learning in My Liberal University.
A common right-wing trope is this chronic distaste for academia. Academia, while not a threat to the ruling class as a whole, is threatening to certain segments of the ruling class, the segment that conservatives represent. Capitalism has both reactionary and progressive elements within it. It was the bourgeois capitalists who overthrew the European absolute monarchs and ended feudalism. This is where liberalism originated, among these revolutionaries. Conservatism originated as the counter-movement to these bourgeois revolutions. While modern conservatives certainly don't want to reinstate feudal monarchies, they still want to preserve traditional hierarchies. The bourgeois revolutions were deeply intellectual movements, closely tied with the quote-unquote Enlightenment. They emphasized rational thought over acceptance of dogma. Liberal academia still embraces this tradition, and this is why it makes conservatives so uneasy. Conservatives are especially horrified at the thought of working-class people getting an education. Education can indoctrinate workers, but it can also give workers tools to escape indoctrination, as well as the practical skills needed to organize and carry out successful uprisings. Conservatives desire a working class that is stupid and complacent. And because of this, anti-intellectualism has always been a major aspect of conservative ideology. Modern conservatives correctly see educational institutions as a threat to them.
Okay? And this is kind of everything you want to know about Marx and communism that your professor with the bust of Karl Marx isn't going to be telling you about. And I'll have students who will email me and say, could you please come to my campus to give a talk on why communism is bad? Because my econ professor literally has a bust of Karl Marx in his office.
Ah yes, the dreaded, ubiquitous Marxist college professor. I've never met a Marxist college professor despite going to college for 4 years, but apparently they're everywhere. You know what? I forgot to count. If you plan to watch this video in its entirety, please take a shot every time he mentions students, professors, or universities and then report back to me. I need to know how drunk you get.
This drives me crazy. I go to different campuses and all the time I'll run into somebody who will say, well, the Communist Manifesto is a pretty good book if you just read it. Talks about love and sharing and helping your fellow man. I'll say, oh yeah, have you read it? Well, I've skipped around a little bit here and there. I'm like, come on, man, you haven't read it.
Alex, I'll take conversations that never took place for 600. Oh, a daily double? I'm betting it all.
Because if you actually read this, and you should read it, and it won't take long, very, very short. It's not like Das Kapital, which will take you weeks.
Aw, see, look, even Paul is telling you to go read theory. Thank you, Paul. Eat your veggies, get 8 hours of sleep, read theory, take your meds. Common sense.
No one who walks away from reading that book is going to say, wow, that was a pretty good book. I think we should do that. Which is why I think, too, a lot of Marxist professors don't actually have their students read Marx, right? Because then they wouldn't become Marxist students.
At this point, let's open up our copy of the manifesto and follow along as Paul is speaking.
So it opens up, this book written in 1848, A Spectre is Haunting Europe. And there's a line in there where they say the entire theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Well, kind of says it all, doesn't it? Abolition of private property. And right there, anybody with a cell phone who likes their stuff, right, who wants a house, a big house, whatever, right there, that's, red flag, pun intended, right? Right? But the entire theory may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And it's not like they then later say, well, we didn't really mean that. They double down on it repeatedly throughout the book.
Hey, Paul, buddy, what is that you just said a couple minutes ago to that college student who never existed? Cool. Did you read it? Because, I did read it. It's right here, Chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. Just a few paragraphs from the start of the chapter. The thing I love about the Communist Manifesto, if you actually read it, is that it anticipates and destroys common right-wing talking points 170 years in advance. It blows my mind that people are still using straw men and bad faith arguments that were absolutely eviscerated in the 1840s. This is one of the best-selling books in history, and it is available free online. And yet right-wingers have never even bothered to read and respond to Marx and Engels' counter-arguments. And it's short. You should read it. Careful what you ask for, Paul. Let's look at this passage. Basically, what Uncle Carl and Uncle Freddie are saying is that our concept of property rights has changed over time. In the days of feudalism, property rules were different. But then the French Revolution happened. The bourgeoisie stole property from the aristocrats and nobles, and then redefined what it meant to own property altogether. They abolished feudal property, but they didn't abolish the concept of property itself. And now, we proletarians want to abolish bourgeois property and create a new social order of property rules that suits our interests. What's the difference? Bourgeois property allows a boss to take other people's work, sell it as if it were their own, and keep the profits for themselves. A factory owner claims ownership over the factory and the work done by hundreds of workers. Bourgeois property is private ownership over things that are publicly used and produced. This is the type of system we want to abolish. We have no problem with people who own property that they use to do the work themselves, and no problem with people who make a living selling their own work, and only their own work. We do not want to abolish property altogether. We want to abolish private property, bourgeois property, capitalist property.
You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property? And then what do they say? Well, no, we didn't mean that literally. No, precisely so, that is just what we intend.
Basically what they're saying in this passage is, there's no point in complaining about abolishing private property when for most people, private property has already been abolished. Capitalism cannot function unless there is insane inequality of wealth, unless there is a class of owners and a much bigger class of people who own nothing and must rely on the owner class in order to survive. Only a small minority would lose any property if the communists got their way. Apologists for capitalism say the right to own property is essential to individual rights, but since most people have no private property, these apologists clearly only care for the individual rights of the rich and powerful. Yeah, we're getting rid of private property. We're getting rid of a person's right to claim private ownership over other people's work and workplaces. But for the 100th time, we're not abolishing property altogether. Marx and Engels are very clear. There is personal property, things that you made yourself or things you own for your own personal use, and there's private property, things you own that other people make and other people use, which allows you to privately appropriate socially produced wealth. Of course, Paul could be lying, which I suspect since he clearly has read the text, but he also could legitimately be unable to understand what the text is saying, since he's completely stuck in a bourgeois mindset. Paul, a shill for the ruling class, who thinks the way the bourgeoisie do, cannot wrap his mind around the distinction. Since the bourgeoisie do not see workers as human beings, a capitalist actually does believe that he made the things that his workers made. He sees the workers simply as tools of his own trade, one more piece of machinery that he has to buy for his own purposes. And so of course he cannot make the distinction between your own work and the appropriation of someone else's work.
Marx said that communism represents the most radical rupture in traditional relations. Here's another thing. These guys weren't tinkering around on the edges. This is a totalitarian ideology that really seeks to fundamentally transform human nature. This is one of my favorite phrases. It's awful favorite phrase, right? But communism seeks to abolish the present state of things. Wow. They're against whatever is in the past. There's no moral absolutes, which is completely unlike conservatism, which believes in first things, permanent things, moral absolutes. Progressives believe that they're always progressing, which is why their definition of marriage in 2015 for a Democrat or a liberal was completely different from where it was in 1995. And if you ask them right now, what would be your definition of it in 2038? The best answer would be, I don't know. I'll tell you when we get there.
This is the part of the lecture that is most baffling to me. Paul lists Marx and Engels' demands, explaining how radical they are, and then he just thinks that that alone is reason enough to stand against them, as if they are obviously bad. But if it were obvious, there would be no Marxist movement. Paul, you have to explain why radicalism is bad in and of itself. He is speaking to some common understanding conservatives have among themselves, which makes absolutely no sense to me as an outsider. I'm especially confused as to why he thinks something that challenges the status quo is automatically bad. I guess maybe it's because he is among the group of people who are most benefiting from the status quo, and knows that change likely would not be in his favor, but I think there's something more. Conservatives have a fetish for preserving current situations or going back to systems of the past. They see the world as static, and they are deeply and existentially afraid of facing the idea that it isn't. But think about it. In your own life, even if it's been short so far, you've probably seen many, many different things change in society and in your own life. And you know from experience that after things change, they almost never go back to the way they were before. Society changes because of internal contradictions within society itself. The stuff that exists in society interacts in such a way that it pushes toward a change. Populations grow, technology advances, new books are published, and new ideas enter the discourse. Yeah, we can bet our asses that the definition of marriage is going to change too, inevitably. Preserving the status quo is physically impossible. If you have a baby human, the cells in their body automatically divide, and you cannot stop that baby from growing into an adult. We know that the current social order, both its good and its bad aspects, will one day be destroyed, because the current social order that we live in didn't always exist. As to what comes next, we have two possibilities in front of us. Either things will get better for working class people, or they'll get worse. It is socialism or barbarism. And this is one of the most terrifying realities I think we face as human beings. But to cling to the past or work to turn back the clock is just out of touch with reality and reflects a lack of emotional maturity, in my opinion. Like, society is going to change. Get over it, snowflake. And while this constant change is scary, we can also view it as a positive. If things can change, we might just be able to change them for the better.
Marx and Engels had a 10-point plan in the Communist Manifesto. Point number 1, abolition of property and land. 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax.
Fuck yeah.
Tell this, number 3, to some of your friends who like Marx or have good things to say about communism.
Ooh, I'm a friend who likes Marx and communism. Tell it to me, tell it to me.
Abolition of all right of inheritance. How'd you like that?
That's the horrible policy that's supposed to change my mind about Marxism? I mean, if you have rich parents, I guess it's kind of scary, but I'm not sure why that should bother us normal people.
4, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank. That's number 5, actually. I didn't list all 10. 6, centralization of means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. I mean, imagine taking all communication services and all transport and turning them over to the state. Railroad, shipping, trucking.
Trucking! Oh no, not trucking!
Look at this one. This is one of my favorite. Gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by what? By a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Think about what that means. You're going to redistribute people? It's not enough to redistribute their property. You want a more equitable distribution of the population. That means you have to take people and force them out of their houses that you're going to take and put them in a more equitable distribution in the countryside, wherever you want to put them. You ever see the beginning of the movie, The Killing Fields, Cambodia? They're all being emptied out of the main city. They're being equitably distributed. And I've had socialists and Marxists say, well, the beginning of The Killing Fields, I would never advocate that. Well, what do you mean? They're going by the book. They're doing what Marx and Engels said.
Whoa, that's kind of a big jump, to go from get rid of the rural-urban distinction to violently round people up and forcibly relocate them. The text said gradual, Paul. If we go by the book, we're doing it gradually. The only thing necessary to erase the rural and urban divide would be to develop the economies and infrastructure in rural areas. In the United States, this has already happened for a large part of the country. My town of dank-ass nowhere, Ohio, has about 30,000 residents. On the topic of Cambodia, I haven't read that much about Cambodia, but I can tell you this. Societies do not suddenly erupt into unspeakable violence just because some asshole read a random book. Civil war, genocide, state violence is the result of conflicts that naturally occur in all class-based societies. Conflicts that have to be resolved somehow. Cambodia had a pre-existing condition, a social problem or tension that existed long before Pol Pot came along. And it's possible that tension had been going on for hundreds of years. This isn't to say that the people in charge should be left off the hook, but books don't start civil wars. Class conflict does. Blaming Karl Marx for the Khmer Rouge is as ridiculous as blaming violent video games for the Columbine shooting. Ooh, what do you want to bet Paul actually does blame video games for Columbine?
10, free education for all children in public schools, which is one of the first things the Bolsheviks did.
Based?
Took all schools away from the Russian Orthodox Church, banned all home education, and put everybody in government schools.
The distaste for public school is kind of a thing for these petty bourgeois Catholics. My uncle with 9 kids homeschooled them all. And while my parents were not exactly petty bourgeois, me and my siblings were homeschooled and sent to Catholic school, K through 12. And while I got a good education, it also stunted my social development and my political development as well, since I had little exposure to people outside my socioeconomic group. Alternative education is not necessarily a healthy environment for kids, in my opinion. I think kids should be well socialized with the community in which they live. Private schools and homeschooling allow reactionary parents to shelter their kids from alternative ideologies. It allows religious cults to indoctrinate children unchallenged. Homeschooling can also protect abusers. Parents who choose alternative education often do so because of racist or classist attitudes, consciously or subconsciously. They don't want their 8 precious babies mingling with the filthy proles, where they'll learn to listen to beat-bop music and inject marijuana. The religious education movement really kicked off around the end of Jim Crow. White parents didn't want their kids hanging out with black kids. Kids need integrated educational environments, and parents should not be given the choice to self-segregate.
Now, if you're wondering, Marx and Engels that dumb? Didn't they realize that this would require despotism to do this? No, they got it. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads. My 6-year-old daughter, Gianna, could tell you, Daddy, they're going to have to kill people to do this. Yep. People aren't just going to lay down and say, oh yeah, just take my inheritance, take my property, do what you want with my children, whatever else, go for it. Yeah, no problem. People aren't going to do that.
You know what? Let's talk about this, okay? Listen, son, you're almost a man now. Your father and I want to sit you down and talk about the facts of life. It's time we discussed revolutionary violence. When we discuss revolutionary violence, there are 4 things we need to consider. First, violence will occur with or without a revolution. We live in a class-based society. All class-based societies see violent clashes between the working class and the ruling class. The working class gets to a point where conditions are so bad they have to rebel somehow. No one has to incite a rebellion or brainwash the masses to get them to do this. They do it because they have to. However, it is almost always the ruling class who starts the actual violence. If the masses are desperate enough, they will respond with violence of their own. These movements can potentially turn into revolutions, or they can turn into civil wars, but more often than not, they are violently suppressed and fizzle out. We can't stop this from happening just by adopting a pacifist ideology. Working class uprisings are inevitable. Being a revolutionary means that when these uprisings do inevitably occur, we want the working class to fight back and win and take power. Second, just like how we cannot stop working class uprising, we also cannot induce working class uprising either. The working class rebels when they are damn good and ready to rebel. There are many reasons why working class people accept their oppression most of the time. And it isn't because they're mindless sheep, either. It's primarily due to the very rational desire to avoid unnecessary risk, and knowing better than to pick fights that you can't win. In the olden days, anarchists would commit acts of terrorism in hopes that it would inspire the masses to revolt. It never worked. Our job as revolutionaries is to educate working class people and build up strong left-wing organizations, so that when revolt does happen, the working class has the tools it needs to fight and win. Third, even though revolt is inevitable, and the ruling class inevitably will use violence against it, the most important revolutionary tactics are non-violent in nature. One of the most effective tactics available to us working class people is the general strike. This requires an amazing amount of coordination, organization, and courage, but we can do it. And it works. It wasn't the Bolsheviks or the Red Army that overthrew the Russian Tsar in 1917. It was all the factory girls in Petrograd who decided one day to have themselves a general strike. They shut the city down and the Tsar had no choice but to surrender. Fourth, revolutionary violence must be put in context. Even during quote-unquote peacetime, capitalism is unspeakably violent. Mass incarceration, police brutality, poverty, hunger, lack of access to housing, healthcare, and sanitation. Capitalism kills people. It's a brutal system that constantly forces working class people between rocks and hard places. For the working class to take up arms and fight back, that's not initiating violence. That's self-defense. And it's not like refusing to revolt would somehow prevent war. The ruling class starts plenty of horrifically deadly wars all on their own, and they will continue to do so until they are overthrown. At a certain point, pacifism stops being noble and starts being cowardly. The question isn't, are we justified in using force? The question is whether or not force is an effective tactic in our particular situation, and if so, what type of force we should use. If we truly do want a non-violent world, we can't have that without first overthrowing the ruling class. We Marxists are not calling for Americans to take up arms and march on Capitol Hill tomorrow, but we're not pacifists, and we don't think there's anything particularly admirable about rigid pacifism either. By the way, here is the entirety of Marx and Engels' 10-point plan. You can pause and read it yourself if you would like.
What they said about home education and religious education, look at this one. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead, no, we don't want to do that. We plead guilty. Guilty.
Paul, hey. Paul, do you think parents have the right to exploit their children? Is that why you had 8 of them? Because, I got some questions, buddy.
You won't be learning this in Poli-Sci 101 at Progressive View, where they're focused on race all the time, right? Where they want to know every single member of the Confederacy or founding father who had a slave, where they're tearing down statues.
I've seen far more earth-shattering revelations than learning that white dudes from the 1800s were racists, but Marx and Engels' personal moral characters are much less important to me than the quality of their theories. I have addressed this point in my previous video responding to Paul's work. My goal is the empowerment of the working class. I and many working class people before me, from all races and across the globe, are in agreement that reading Marx can help us do that. But if Paul wants to talk about the moral character of dead assholes, why not humor him? He calls us leftist hypocrites for reading Marx while tearing down statues of slave owners. But I'm not seeing the hypocrisy here. There's a big moral difference between using a racial slur in private correspondence and getting rich off of human trafficking. They're both wrong, but they're not comparable. You're a good Catholic, Paul. You know the difference between a mortal and a venial sin. And while Marx and Engels picked up negative cultural attitudes from the place where they grew up, as all of us do, they still made a choice at the end of the day of which side they were going to fight for. And that choice matters. Throughout their careers, Marx and Engels unambiguously supported the abolition of slavery. They correctly viewed it as part of the greater struggle for working class emancipation. They were also unapologetic opponents of colonialism too. They were very outspoken, for example, about the British occupation of Ireland and the horrific exploitation and brutality it entailed. If we're going to cancel either of them, I say cancel Engels for being a bourgeois factory owner. But again, that doesn't erase the good he did on the side, and it certainly doesn't mean his theories are useless.
But they never tell you what Margaret Sanger said. I don't talk about any of that. They don't tell you what Woodrow Wilson said. No, they want to put those people on Mount Rushmore.
You didn't cancel Woodrow Wilson. Yes, we did, asshole. What rock have you been living under? He's trying to think of racists whom he thinks will be heroes to the left, and the best he can come up with is Margaret Sanger and Woodrow Wilson. Oh my god. Can you please, once in your life, have an actual conversation with an actual Marxist?
That's what he called him. By the way, Paul committed suicide in a suicide pact with Marx's daughter. One of 2 of Marx's daughters who committed suicide. Wasn't exactly the greatest dad.
Well, I certainly can believe that Karl Marx was a bad father. Bad fathers are kind of a dime a dozen. For example, you, Paul, expressed shock and horror at the thought that you might not be allowed to exploit your 8 children.
Marx and Lenin on religion. Religion, said Marx, is the what? Opiate of the masses. He also said, in a quote not as well known, Communism begins where atheism begins. Lenin said all worship of a divinity is a necrophilia.
All worship of the divinity is necrophilia. I want that on a shirt.
There is nothing more abominable than religion. Nothing more abominable than religion.
Why have Marxists historically advocated for atheism? Dialectical materialism, which is so useful for clearly analyzing the world around us, means a rejection in belief of the supernatural. But the main objection to religion is that it is a powerful tool the ruling class uses for social control. It's how the ruling class often ideologically justifies their power. It discourages people from questioning authority and creates long lists of rules to control people's behavior. Of course, this doesn't justify the oppression of religion we saw under Stalinism. And we do have to remember there are plenty of religious leftists, even movements that combine religious elements with Marxist activism. But historically, religion hasn't necessarily been an ally in the fight for working class emancipation.
War in the Family, Marx wrote to Engels, "Blessed is he who has no family." And they actually say right in the manifesto, "Abolition of the family!" ! Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. In 1848, abolition of the family was already an infamous proposal of the communists.
So do Marxists want to destroy the nuclear family? I mean, I don't know of any Marxist organizations who are actively calling for the abolition of marriage or instituting mandatory communal child rearing, but historically, Marxists have been harsh critics of the nuclear family. And many early Marxist revolutionaries did dream of a society without the nuclear family. The nuclear family isn't exactly a natural setup. For most of human history, humans lived communally in large extended families. And for our earliest ancestors, neither men nor women were expected to be monogamous to a single partner. It wasn't until the rise of class-based society that we see modern concepts of sexual morality. And it wasn't until the rise of capitalism itself that we see anything resembling a nuclear family, with two parents who live together and raise their children all on their own. The nuclear family asks parents to sequester themselves away from the rest of society. Parents have to do all the childcare themselves and have to economically provide for their families all on their own, whereas in the old days, the community shared responsibility for childcare. The nuclear family also isolates women in the home. This isolation is economically and psychologically stressful, and it puts women and children at risk of abuse. Returning to a communal model of child rearing would probably be much healthier for all of us.
All right, 1917, the Bolsheviks take over. Who are those three? Stalin, Trotsky, and Lenin. Yeah, Lenin and Trotsky, all right?
I'm sorry, what did he say? Go back.
Stalin, Trotsky, and Lenin. Yeah, Lenin and Trotsky, all right?
That's not Leon Trotsky. That's Mikhail Kalinin. Okay. Mikhail Kalinin wasn't some rank-and-file Bolshevik, okay? He was the literal goddamn head of state of the entire Soviet Union. Like all of Prussia is named after him now. It's not like how would you think that's Trotsky? I mean, it kind of looks like him, but if you put a picture side by side, you can clearly see they're different. Oh my god, my soul has left my body. Mikhail Kalinin was the head of state starting in 1919 until 1946 when he died of cancer. Stalin was not the head of state. He was the head of the Communist Party. So Stalin gets to run around and have his face on all of the posters all over town and get to have his picture taken with Winston Churchill. while Kalinin, the literal head of state, just stays home and signs paperwork. Honestly, it sounds like a fun job, though, because you get all of the perks with none of the responsibility. I choose to imagine that he just hung out all day at the Kremlin smoking weed. And Kalinin was a major cuck. Okay? Yeah, the guy was a huge cuck. At one point, Stalin actually sends Kalinin's wife into a gulag, and Kalinin does nothing. He's like, okay, I guess my wife's in a gulag now. I'm just gonna have to deal with that, I guess. Stalin sent Molotov's wife to a gulag too, and Molotov did nothing. Now, Paul should know that that is not Leon Trotsky. First of all, you can see by looking at his face that it's not Leon Trotsky, though they do kind of look similar. And in fairness to Paul, most Americans don't know who Mikhail Kalinin is. And I didn't even know who he was until I did a reverse Google image search with this picture, upon which I discovered that many different websites misidentify him as Leon Trotsky. So even a person who was double-checking things and doing their research still might walk away thinking that this was Trotsky. But Paul has a PhD in political science. He has built his career talking about socialism in socialist countries. He should have a decent understanding of the history of the Soviet Union. And he should know who Mikhail Kalinin is. He gets paid to talk about this stuff. He has no excuse to get this wrong.
Communism immediately goes global because that's what it was intended to be. Marx and Engels finished the Communist Manifesto by saying, "Workers of the world unite." And they said this from the very beginning. It is in our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent.
Hey, fuck yeah, comrade, make that bitch permanent. Woohoo!
Not only in one country, but all the leading countries of the world, because they launched the revolution not just to take over Russia, Russia's what they could take, but exclusively counting on world revolution. They wanted the whole world to be communist.
I'm sorry, I'm tearing up a little bit.
And look at this bottom quote here from Lenin, March 1919. "We live not only a state, but in a system of states, and the existence of the Soviet Republic side by side with the imperialist states is what? Yeah, we could all learn to get along, right? Unthinkable. In the end, either one or the other will hold hands and sing Kumbaya, will conquer." They were never content just to screw up Russia. They wanted this all over the world.
I'm planning to make a video in the future on Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, so I won't go into much detail here, but basically the main point of it is that you can't half-ass a revolution. As long as you allow the bourgeoisie to continue existing, you're going to have to continue putting up with their bourgeois tomfoolery. This means that the revolution in your country needs to be done all the way. You can't just overthrow a monarch and institute capitalism. You actually have to implement socialism. And also, a socialist country in isolation can't really thrive or be healthy. Revolution has to be organized on an international scale. Either the revolution is everywhere or it is nowhere. So when they say that the whole world should be communist, we're saying that the success of the entire endeavor depends on making sure that it is indeed global.
They established the Comintern, which would be the organization that would spread communism around the world in March 1919.
This might be a nitpick, but they established the third Comintern in 1919. There had been two Cominterns before that. The first was called the Communist League and was founded by a group of people which included Marx and Engels. It got smashed up by the Prussian government after a failed uprising. The Second International ran from 1889 to 1916, and it fell apart during World War I when all of the member parties decided to be little cuck bitches and promote their country's imperialist war efforts instead of standing up for the working class and demanding peace. Fuck the Second International, especially you, Kautsky.
All right, so they bring it to America. Communist Party USA has been the party in America for 100 years now, going back to, well, almost 1919. Here is the loyalty oath that they swore when they joined Communist Party USA. Look at this. This was from the 1930s, when Stalin was running the Soviet Union. The Hollywood 10, you'll learn about this at Progressive View. They were just a bunch of progressives being hounded by Joe McCarthy, who was so mean. There, show this to your professor. Say, but professor, weren't all 10 of them actual, literal card-carrying members of the Communist Party? That's their numbers. We had them all in October 1947. They had all swore a loyalty oath to Stalin's Soviet Union. They were committed Soviet patriots.
I don't think Paul really understands the concept of internationalism. I think the concept of solidarity as a whole is foreign to him. He's a reactionary who can't wrap his mind around it. They weren't loyal to the USSR. They were loyal to communism as a whole. The USSR was just the first country to become socialist, and keeping it afloat was essential for the international fight for working class emancipation. If America ever becomes socialist, knock on wood, we would create our own unique form of American socialism that suits the needs of American society, just like how every socialist country before has created their own form. Also, are we really defending McCarthyism now? Is that how low we've sunk? Oh, but actually they were communists. Under American law, you have a right to be a communist. Not that I value American law as something in and of itself worth preserving, but I think it's fair enough that we ask these chuds to play by their own rules. You know what? This is kind of a mask-off moment for Paul, outing himself as a true blue authoritarian.
Some other famous American communists that you've probably never heard of: Frank Marshall Davis, Barack Obama's mentor in the 1970s.
Oh no! Barack Obama, the king of the communists. That's why his solution to the healthcare crisis was, oh my god, let me go check my notes for a second. Okay. Force everyone to buy health insurance whether or not they could afford it. True ally to the working class. The bourgeoisie quiver before him.
They referred to the party underground in Hawaii as the church. His Communist Party USA number was 47544. He was called to the Senate to testify on his Soviet activities in December 1956, and he pled the fifth. Mr. Davis, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? I plead the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. But this is what's so appalling about this is they would wrap themselves in the U.S. Constitution, which would have been the first thing that they torched.
Jesus H. Christ, we're going to write a new constitution, okay? And we're gonna keep all of the fun stuff. This guy here, Frank Marshall Davis, he was a poet, author, and intellectual who participated in left-wing and labor movements. He once wrote for a leftist newspaper called the Chicago Star. I could not confirm whether or not he was specifically a communist or if he was ever a member of the Communist Party. When I Google him, most of the sources that pop up are from right-wing sites trying to red scare about Obama. In leftist circles, he's not really considered to be a major leader of the movement in any way, but he does seem like a pretty cool dude.
Others, Angela Davis, who is the most famous American female communist. There she is meeting with Fidel Castro at the very bottom, and above that, if any of you were there, she was one of the speakers at the Women's March in Washington, as she talked not about Marx and Lenin and Marcuse and cultural Marx. She's not going to do that. She's not dumb. She talked about gay rights, immigration, flora, fauna, ecology, climate change. She knows what to do.
I don't think Angela Davis has ever been coy about being a communist, though it probably would have been inappropriate for her to bring it up with a politically diverse crowd when she was there to talk about just a specific issue. Although I certainly hope her speech somehow managed to connect the fight for women's rights with the fight to emancipate the working class as a whole.
All right, meet Che and Fidel, two vicious commie thugs who wanted to blow up the world. I could give an hour just on these two guys. I don't know what they're lighting there on the left. I think it might be a dynamite. I'm not exactly sure what that is. These two guys actually wanted to launch the nukes in October 1962, which would have unleashed nuclear Armageddon. Hundreds of millions of people would have died in the nuclear exchange.
All right, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what happened was the Soviets decided to put a nuclear missile on Cuba so that they could better target the United States should push come to shove. As a person who lives in the United States, I'm obviously not very cool with that, but we have to consider the fact that the United States already had a shit ton of missiles targeted at the USSR, located in various European countries. The USSR wanted to push back and quote-unquote even the playing field. American spy planes discovered the Cuban Missile, and this kicked off a huge standoff. Eventually, the USSR agreed to remove the missile from Cuba in exchange for the US promising not to invade Cuba and agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey. I could not verify whether or not the Cuban government proposed firing upon the United States. Maybe they did. But we have to consider the context. The United States was threatening to bomb or invade Cuba. They had already attempted to invade before. It makes sense that small countries with a history of being invaded would want to get themselves some nukes. And it makes sense that the government of that small country would consider all options on the table in order to prevent a bigger country from initiating unspeakable violence upon them. I don't mean to oversimplify the crisis. It might not necessarily be smart to paint it as a standoff between unambiguously good guys and unambiguously bad guys. But lest we forget, there is only one government that has ever actually used nuclear weapons in war, okay? And it wasn't a communist one. Also, I'm pretty sure they're lighting a cigar.
Approximately 100,000 Cubans attempted to swim to Florida. Cuba is a surreal island that doesn't have boats because the boating industry is banned and controlled. The fishing industry is banned. Ask anybody who lives down there, they don't eat fish. They can't get fish because people aren't allowed to fish, because fishermen holding the fishing pole jump in the water and start swimming. Swimming is banned. The number of people killed by communist governments, according to the Harvard University Press book, The Black Book of Communism, which was published in 1999, the figure is about 100 million.
Hey, he mentioned the Black Book. Everybody take a shot. Shots, 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 shots. I feel in the future I'm going to have to go through an independent debunking of the Black Book, but I'm just going to link to other YouTubers who have already done that.
In history. So which country killed the most deaths? China, which that says 65 million. It's probably more like 70 million.
Arr! I was out at sea, illegally sailing me boat off the coast of Cuba. I was about to bring in me catch when I saw them. 70 million corpses bobbing in the water. Oi, that's a load of shite. Last time you told this story, it was only 65 million. I swear upon me mother's grave, it was 70 million. 75 million even. But I only caught a glimpse of them before the Kraken emerged and dragged their corpses down to the Caribbean depths. And then I rowed ashore and made love to a mermaid who was awaiting for me on the beach.
Alexander Yakovlev, who was Gorbachev's chief reformer, who was given the job in the 1990s of counting the skulls, published a book with Yale University Press on this called A Century of Violence in Soviet Russia. He said Stalin alone killed 60 to 70 million.
Stalin alone? You mean he did it all by himself? How did that work? Did he just spend all day with a shotgun and they would just line up all the kulaks for him to shoot? Who ran the government? 65 million. Jesus H. Christ. How would that even have been practically possible? The Soviet Union had a population of about 100 million people at the time of the revolution, and I imagine it grew a bit by the time Stalin took power. But essentially, they're alleging that one dictator killed 40 to 60% of the entire country's population. The Black Death killed about 30% of Europe's population, and it fundamentally, permanently transformed European society just because of the disruption it caused. 40 to 60%, that would cause complete and total societal collapse. The government would have just broken down before they could even get a fraction that far. And if that happened, everybody probably would have just gone back to being peasant subsistence farmers like they had been before. And when you consider that just a decade or so later, they were literally inventing space travel, that's not something that countries can do after losing half of their population. At this point, Paul is just making shit up. This is beyond silly. It's a parody of itself.
So you take just those two countries, probably actually get 140 million.
140, I tell ya. Cross me heart and hope to die.
A sense of comparison. That would be Hitler killed about 10 million. So it dwarfs what Hitler did.
Okay, this is the part where it stops being funny. To assign Hitler a death count of 10 million is as batshit crazy as assigning 65 million to Stalin. I believe Paul got that figure by counting up all the people who were killed in the Holocaust. First of all, I'm fairly sure the Holocaust killed about 12 million people, not 10 million, but that's a nitpick. The issue is, the Holocaust was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to Hitler's crimes. Hitler and his fascist friends started a war that killed about 1% of the Earth's entire population. The USSR alone lost 26 million people. And we can't just blame Hitler for civilian deaths either. He deserves blame for the soldiers' deaths too, because all of those people should have been at home with their wives and kids, instead of fighting some dumbass imperialist war. Of course, the Allies did commit war crimes of their own, for which the fascists cannot be blamed, but it wasn't exactly tit for tat. A death count of 65 million sounds like Paul is alleging that Stalin was trying to commit mass genocide, to depopulate the land for nefarious purposes. And while he certainly was a nefarious person, that is not consistent with what we know about him based on what he wrote, said, and the things we know for sure that he did. But you know who did have mass genocidal intent? Hitler. Hitler wanted to do what the US government did in America, to clear out all of the indigenous people and claim the territory for settlers. He planned to either murder or enslave everyone in Eastern European countries like Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and move Germans onto the land. Just as he hated Jews and the Roma, he also hated the Slavs. That's what he meant by the term Lebensraum, living space. Yeah. And while Stalin was certainly an asshole, I'm not sure you could call him any worse than the leaders of the liberal bourgeois countries. Trying to compare Stalin and other communists to Hitler is like trying to compare apples to an entire barrel of rotten, moldy oranges. So why is Paul playing this game? Why is he downplaying Hitler's crimes while inventing fantastic fairy tales about the communists? Because, well, Paul recognizes he has more in common with the fascists than he does the communists. I don't really think that Paul is a fascist. I don't get that vibe from him. But at the end of the day, Paul is a right-winger, and so were the Nazis. Fascists and standard conservatives have some common material goals. They want to uphold traditional hierarchies, suppress working-class dissent, preserve the power of the ruling class. American conservatives accept the premise of liberal bourgeois democracy because, so far, liberal democracy has been fairly good at preserving the ruling class's authority. But under periods of crisis, liberal democracy can't do that anymore. And if that happens, the ruling class and its lackeys would rather side with the fascists, would rather become fascists, than give even the smallest concessions to the working class. And I think on a subconscious level, Paul knows this. Of course he wants to demonize the movement for working class emancipation. Of course he wants to make fascism seem like a kinder, gentler alternative. This is a trope I've seen from right-wingers before, and frankly, it's pretty disgusting. Paul really should be ashamed of himself.
1 in 4 Americans believe that George W. Bush killed more people than Joseph Stalin. Oh yeah, Bush killed 75-80 million, didn't he?
Arr, 'twas Stalin himself, riding upon a white whale. I saw it with me own eyes, the moonlight glistening off his mustache, and in his hand he had the damnable harpoon gun, with which he personally slaughtered the 70 million people. But I only got a glimpse of the old bastard before the sea serpent overturned me lifeboat, and I was cast forth into the waves. And that whale's name was George W. Bush.
Last thing, you guys probably hear this a lot. I'm not a communist or a socialist. I'm a social democrat. I'm a democratic socialist. I'm a progressive. Well, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin were part of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party.
In the old days, social democracy was a generic term for socialist. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin indeed did call themselves social democrats. Around the time of the Russian Revolution, a major rift grew between the reformist left and the revolutionary left. The revolutionaries started to call themselves Marxists or communists instead of social democrats. And the reformists, eager not to cause conflict with the bourgeoisie, started moving further and further to the right. They ran in bourgeois elections, rejected Marxism, and stopped calling for the end of capitalism altogether. And now, everyone using the term social democrat is a reformist. And the definition of the term has changed to reflect that new reality. So it's kind of like when Republicans bring up the fact that, oh, actually the Democrats supported slavery, ignoring the fact that the Democratic Party used to be filled with right-wingers. So no, modern social democrats are not Marxists and are not a threat to the capitalist establishment.
So they use that word a lot of times. In fact, they use it a lot of times to hoodwink and dupe genuine liberal progressives who don't know that they're being used. Like if Angela Davis was standing at that Women's March, she would say, how many of you are progressives? Woo-hoo! You know, a bunch of them would say that. But then she would say, well, I'm a communist, but I'm going to pretend to be. You know, they don't say that. I'm a progressive too. Yay! It's what they do. So this is where people are going, to the socialist side, democratic socialism, as they're calling it.
So why do conservatives constantly accuse liberals of being secret revolutionaries? I'm pretty sure they actually can tell the difference. And I think it's to get liberals to purge and suppress the leftmost segments of their parties and organizations. Liberals and conservatives actually get along really well. That's why they go to Congress to argue about their differences instead of killing each other in the streets. They represent different wings of the ruling class, which as a whole benefits from the stability of liberal democracy. Liberals don't like leftists. Liberal presidents are just as vicious at persecuting American leftists as conservatives are, and if liberals are being accused of being leftists, they will attempt to manage their image. We see how the Democrats sabotaged Bernie Sanders' campaign and how hostile they've been to the quote-unquote squad. I don't think they have the legal power to remove those guys from office since they won their elections fair and square, but they certainly have no intention of making their lives easy. We also saw this happen in Britain recently, where Jeremy Corbyn and other progressives were expelled from the Labour Party over bullshit accusations of anti-Semitism.
All right, so I'm over my time. I need to stop and take some questions while I still have time to take questions. All right, thank you.
As a show of good faith, I'll list some things that I liked about the lecture. Paul is at least willing to read Marxist literature and familiarize himself with our ideas, which is far more than we can say about some other reactionaries. Looking at you, Jordan Peterson. Pew, 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 sick burn. He's a good speaker, too. He's a lot more dynamic and charismatic than the impression I got while reading his article. But at the end of the day, he's using his very limited talents for evil and not good. Paul's arguments are sloppy. Sometimes I think this is an accident, like misidentifying Mikhail Kalinin in a photo, but other times I feel like he's purposefully trying to confuse his audience, like how he tells us to go read Marx and then blatantly misreads the text he just cited in order to suit his own worldview. Or when he cites fantastical claims about socialist countries that can be debunked with a quick Google search. He has a PhD, for Christ's sake. He knows what it's like to pour years of blood, sweat, and tears into intellectually rigorous work. But when it comes to defending his convictions and values, for some reason, this is the best he can come up with. And the anti-intellectual sentiment he displayed throughout the talk just goes to show that there are few things he hates more than actual honest critical thinking and analysis. He doesn't just want to shut down communism. He also wants to shut down anything the slightest bit challenging to his rigid principles, which is why he's so willing to compare moderates who are no threat to the establishment with the evil commies of the past. Of course, this point about the progressives and the supposed threat they are kind of confuses me. Are progressives stupid dolts who know nothing about Marx? Or are they sneaky Marxists who know exactly what they're doing, but are just trying to weasel their way into mainstream discourse? Does Paul think that by reading Marx, students will disavow Marxism? Or does he think that it will get students to disavow the left altogether, since Marxism and the moderate left are so obviously linked? If anyone who reads Marx disavows Marxism, how does he explain the existence of the Marxist movement in the first place? I think what Paul is trying to say is that there are a few Marxist masterminds controlling all of the left, and that all the young moderates are their stupid pawns whom they are manipulating and slowly turning into Marxists. Conservatives, who see the world as a system of hierarchies and who vastly underestimate the intelligence of working-class people, cannot wrap their head around the idea of an organic populist movement. Clearly, the reason so many young people are turning towards socialism is not because they are seeing the horrors of capitalism firsthand. It's not because they're organizing in their own self-interest. No, it must be because some sneaky commie professor, fake progressive, is duping them into hating capitalism for their own evil agenda. And often for right-wingers, this supposed mastermind has 3 fat anti-Semitic parentheses around him. At the beginning of the talk, they appealed to liberal values of honest debate and listening to the opposite side. But Paul makes no effort to do this. He speaks with the assumption that everyone in his audience already shares his beliefs and values, and shares his bourgeois material interests. Obviously, any rational person is shocked and horrified at the thought of losing the right of inheritance because everyone has rich parents and will likely be rich by the time they themselves die. It reminds me of this line in the manifesto here. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois. They don't consider the perspective of the working class because they don't think of working class people as real people. Diversity of thought, my ass. This brings up the same critique Cameron Hilditch presented in his review of Paul's book, which Paul failed to address in his article. Who is your target audience, Paul? Who are you trying to convince? None of this makes any sense to anyone who doesn't already agree with you. And what do you have to gain by preaching to the choir? Do you want to give right-wingers arguments that they can use in debate? Because if so, you should probably not use arguments that were debunked 170 years ago in the very text you cite. And you should probably base your arguments in actual facts instead of fantastical claims. And please don't cite Nazi propaganda. Do you want to convince left-wingers to change their minds? Because if so, like in the point above, you should probably use good arguments, not bad ones, and you should probably take a minute to consider our point of view and think about what draws us to Marxism in the first place, and not just argue against your straw man of the idiot liberal college student. And Paul clearly does think that college students are idiots, a belief he makes clear multiple times throughout his talk. Which is very interesting to me because he's saying this to a room full of college students. He's taking young people who are early in their political development and he's trying to stunt that development, trying to scare them away from considering the ideas of books they've never even read and people they've never even met. All while telling them over and over again that young people like them are stupid and should not trust their own judgment. It's psychological abuse is what it is. You're an idiot. You need to turn to the grown-ups for answers, and those grown-ups should be me and my bourgeois friends. I don't think college students are actually stupid. I think they're old enough to have a reasonably good understanding of where they fit in class-based society and what their material interests are. This isn't to say that people don't get smarter as they get older, but the opinions of young people should be valued and listened to, especially since young people, more than anyone, have to live with the consequences of the outcomes. And working class people who know their own experiences, who understand their own oppression, they're not stupid either. For more than 100 years, working class people have read Marxist literature because the Marxists understood the world that we live in. They offer analyses that make sense to us, and an actual plan of how to improve our circumstances. You know, a part of me actually hoped that there would be something in this video that would challenge my beliefs, something that would actually get me to consider my own ideology more carefully, that I would walk away smarter, or at least with a more nuanced or detailed understanding of the world. But I didn't get that. I got the same tired arguments we hear from the right all the time, that have been debunked over and over again, line by line. Not a single bit of creativity, intelligence, or even honesty went into his stupid little PowerPoint. And you know, it's actually kind of comforting to me, because while the right is better funded than us and has more institutional power than us, we can sleep easy at night knowing they actually are as stupid as they seem. And if we're organized, willing to put forth the work, and we come to the table with bold, concrete demands that speak to the needs of working class people, this is a fight we actually can win.